You can take your Bibles and go to Philippians chapter 3. We've been looking at some of the background of the Apostle Paul, and we're going to continue doing that this evening. We looked from Acts and saw the records of Paul getting born again. We saw where he started from, how he'd been persecuting the church, how he got born again, and a lot of the events that occurred after that. In Philippians 3, we just get some more information. This is Paul telling a bit more of who he is and what his background was. And he's sharing these things in light of people having confidence in the flesh. People considering that their earthly, worldly accomplishments were the basis for them thinking highly of themselves and thinking that they in some way were better than someone else, and thinking that it was about what they accomplished rather than what Jesus Christ accomplished for them. And so Paul, to make the point that it's all about Jesus Christ, lists that if anybody would have reason to glory in the flesh, he would be the one. In verse 4, we kind of come into this. Though I might also have confidence in the flesh, if any other man thinketh that he hath whereof he might trust in the flesh, I more. And here he gives what made him stand out. Circumcised the 8th day of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin. This is his lineage. He is of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin was one of the two tribes that were split off from the rest of Israel. It was Judah and Benjamin. So the other 10 tribes has, at other times have shared, kind of disappear after they're captivated by the Assyrians. And for a lot of those people that did resurface, and they're from one of those tribes, a lot of people considered, well, yeah, but you were carried away, you were in that land where they mixed other people, you may or may not be really a pure bloodline. But those that were directly from Judah or Benjamin, well, that wasn't a question. So he is a real blue blood, as we would say today. And Hebrew of the Hebrews. A Hebrew of the Hebrews. Now that's got more to it than you may realize just on first reading. When they spoke at this time of being a Hebrew, it was not just speaking about their lineage, that he's already covered that, talking about being of the tribe of Benjamin. When he talks about being a Hebrew, that is opposed to the Judeans that lived outside of Judah and had become swept up in the whole culture of the Greek, which happened with Alexander and the spread of Greek culture and language. So those Judeans who were considered Hellenists were considered those that sort of embraced that Greek culture. They were referred to as Grecians. And that was reflective that they spoke the Greek language and that they also adopted that culture. But those that are referred to as Hebrews is referring to the fact that they are still speaking Aramaic and are still very much living the culture that they grew up in Judah, in Judea. So a Hebrew of Hebrews really indicates that Paul was an Aramaic speaking Judean, which is significant for other reasons. And he's not just a Hebrew, he's a Hebrew of the Hebrews, that he's really, really pure to their culture. As touching the law, a Pharisee. And that's got more in it than just what might meet the eye as well. The Pharisees were those that really were keen on the law. We know that. You know that probably from reading the Gospels. In fact, they were so keen on the law that they weren't happy with just having the Mosaic law. They developed what is called the oral law, their own traditions. And you remember many times Jesus Christ reproving the Pharisees on that point. Why make you the law of none effect by your tradition? That's referring to that oral law that the Pharisees had. So they came up with all these other rules. So that, I would think, if you've ever read the Mosaic law, that would be enough for anybody. There's a lot in there that you're supposed to do. A lot more than just the Ten Commandments. But that wasn't enough for them. They had to have more. And so he's showing that he was all, when it came to the law, he was really a legalist. He was a Pharisee. But the Pharisees, being a Pharisee, that also indicated a couple of other things. One, that they did believe in the resurrection as opposed to the Sadducees. But two, that they were not embracing the Greek culture, nor were they okay with the Roman occupation of Israel. Whereas the Sadducees were okay with both. The Sadducees were much more Hellenized, even if they weren't Greek speaking. They adopted or embraced the culture more. And the Sadducees worked very much in cooperation with the Roman government. So that was opposed by many. But a Pharisee, again, this is just as, good Jewish boy as you could possibly get. Verse 6, concerning zeal, persecuting the church, touching the righteousness which is in the law, blameless. And it goes on. But we see a lot about Paul's background here. We're looking and focusing on what information we gain about Paul. That Paul was of the tribe of Benjamin. That he was a Hebrew of Hebrews. That he was a Pharisee. In fact, not only is Paul a Pharisee, but he is the son of a Pharisee. He didn't just at one day decide he was going to go to Pharisee school and become a Pharisee. He grew up in this. Look at Acts 23. And Paul tells us this in Acts 23 and in verse 6. Acts 23:6. But when Paul perceived that the one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Some translations of that would have the son of a Pharisee, that he was actually a third generation Pharisee. Of the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am called in question. So Paul, his background as boy, he's really, he's so dedicated to all of this. So dedicated that he was raised in a household where his father was a Pharisee, his father's father was a Pharisee, and he is now a Pharisee as well. Look at Acts chapter 22. Again, the Pharisees were opposed to the Greek language and culture. In Acts 22, in verse 3, Paul says, I am verily a man which am a Jew, or Judean. The word Jew doesn't come around until pretty much recent times. Originally in the King James, it was Judean. Born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia. We've seen that before on the map. We've seen where Tarsus is. And it's up there in that region of Cilicia, which is in the greater region of Galatia. And that city of Tarsus made him a Roman citizen by birth. That was part of Tarsus was a significant city. It was a city that was important for trade and other reasons. And not every city that you were born in outside of Judea necessarily made you a Roman citizen by birth, but Tarsus did. That was one of their, I forget the term they used, but it was an important city in the empire. And so he is a Roman citizen as well as being a Judean. He's got a dual citizenship, and that, of course, ends up being beneficial on many occasions. You think about this as Paul travels on his journeys, and you think about the different places where that becomes significant. And we'll get to eventually looking at Paul's experiences when he's in Philippi and how important that becomes there. But it gives him free access to travel and go anywhere he wants at any time. Now, because he's born in Tarsus, many would have that Paul was a Hellenistic Jew or Judean as well, because this was a city where it was outside of Judea, and it was a city that was very influenced by the Greek culture and where many spoke the Greek language. But we just saw that Paul identified himself as a Hebrew of Hebrews. What's more, it says that he was born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet brought up in this city. What city was he speaking about? Where was he at the time? Jerusalem. So he was born in Tarsus, but he didn't stay in Tarsus. A lot of times you'll get that with famous people. 3-4 places will claim them as, he's from here. He's famous enough because they all want to, say we're important because this famous guy was from here. But he might have just been born there and then moved out the next day. We don't know at what age Paul did move out, but we know by the word that's used there that it was when he was still very young. The words brought up indicate that he was very young. I won't get into the whole detail of this, but you can compare this with Acts 7 where it talks about Moses. And there are 3 phrases that are used about both. Born, brought up, and taught. Moses was born, amongst the Israelites. He was brought up by his parents, it says, that were Israelites, and then he was taught by Pharaoh's daughter and by Pharaoh's court. Well, this is the case with Paul. He's born in Tarsus, but he's brought up in Jerusalem. And then at the feet of Gamaliel, he is taught. Really, that way that it's punctuated there is wrong. It should be that he was taught at the feet of Gamaliel. Gamaliel was also a Pharisee. Gamaliel was not only a Pharisee, but a member of the Sanhedrin. And Paul was brought up in Jerusalem, and then he was taught at the feet of Gamaliel, trained by this Pharisee who was a member of the Sanhedrin. Well, what do you think he was being taught? What do you think he was learning at the feet of Gamaliel? He was learning to eventually also be on the council or Sanhedrin. And I'll show you more about that in a minute. And taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward God, as ye all are this day. You see, Paul was a Pharisee. He was raised in Jerusalem. He was taught by Gamaliel in Jerusalem, being trained to be a member of the Sanhedrin himself, and he becomes a member of the Sanhedrin. How do we know that? Well, if you only read King James, it's harder to recognize. If you read other versions, it becomes real apparent. Go back to Acts chapter 6, a record that we looked at in detail, but we're just going to look at a verse there and a couple others in 7 very quickly. In Acts chapter 6, in verse 12, this is when we're getting into the whole huge confrontation between Stephen and, it says, the council. In verse 12, it says, "And they stirred up the people and the elders and the scribes, and came upon him and caught him and brought him to the council." Anybody here have an NIV on you? Well, the NIV version, New International Version, the word council, it's translated Sanhedrin, and that's the word. The Greek word, I forget exactly how you pronounce it, but it kind of looks just like Sanhedrin. The council is the Sanhedrin. Whenever you read the word council, it is the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the ruling body. It was a group of rulers. Now, there were many Sanhedrins throughout Israel. And then there was one great Sanhedrin. It's like you got courts all over everywhere, right? You got all kinds of courts, and then you got the Supreme Court. Well, that's the way it is with the Sanhedrin. You had many lesser Sanhedrins, but then you had in Jerusalem the great Sanhedrin. The great Sanhedrin were 70. Sanhedrins could be anywhere from 23 to 71 people, but the great Sanhedrin was 70. For a long time, the Sadducees really controlled the Sanhedrin, and in fact, didn't even let the Pharisees on it. And then at this point, Pharisees have gotten on the Sanhedrin. Gamaliel was one of them. The Sanhedrin, at this point, that 70, is ruled by the chief priest. That's in there. And he is the president of the Sanhedrin. Look at chapter 7, verse 58. After Stephen's really let them have it, and they let him have it, they stoned him. Verse 58, "And they cast him out of the city and stoned him, and the witnesses laid down their clothes at a young man's feet, whose name was Saul." Why did they lay the clothes down? You think Paul was just some guy that was like passing by and they decided to lay down Stephen's clothes at his feet? No, it was because he was part of the Sanhedrin. You see, Stephen, in this whole confrontation, he's brought before the Sanhedrin. He's put on trial. And he's put on trial before these people who have the authority to put him on trial and to determine whether or not he could be stoned. Saul was one of those. In chapter 8, verse 1, it says, "And Saul was consenting unto his death." That indicates that Paul cast his vote. They voted. All 70 of the Sanhedrin would vote on a matter like this. Paul voted in there for Stephen to be killed. So that's Paul. That's his background. He's a Pharisee of Pharisees, son of Pharisees, son of a son of a, and he is a member of the Sanhedrin. Which also tells us a couple of other significant things about Paul. As a member, in order to be a member of the Sanhedrin, one of the requirements is that you would have had to have been married and that you would have to have a child. So at some point, Paul had been married and had a child. And yet, we know from Corinthians that by that point in time, he is not married. Now, what happened to the wife and the kid, we don't know. You would assume that he would have probably, as time had passed, maybe the child was raised. We don't know what really, though, happened to the wife and the child. But Paul would have, as a member of the Sanhedrin at one point, had a wife and a child. Look at Acts chapter 26. One other place I want to just show you in terms of some of the background here of Paul. In Acts 26 and in verse 14, Paul here is relating again his experience on the road to Damascus when he got born again. And in verse 14 it says, "And when we were all fallen to the earth, I heard a voice speaking unto me, and saying in" what tongue?
Hebrew.
The Hebrew tongue, "Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks." The first time Paul ever received any revelation, it was in the Hebrew tongue. Obviously, that was Paul's native language. Obviously, you would receive revelation in the language that you're most familiar with. And all of that becomes significant when you get down to what language the New Testament was first written in. Most Western scholars, at least, believe that it was first written in Greek. And so much of their logic behind that, so much of their case behind that, is that they want to claim that Paul was a Hellenistic Jew, Judean. But that doesn't line up with what Paul said about himself. So you can either believe Paul, or you can believe the guys who, a couple of thousand years later, decided differently. Well, it's all very interesting in seeing who Paul was. Let's go back now to Acts chapter 15. So this is the background of Paul. Paul, who when we last left him, was in the Council of Jerusalem, where they'd all come together to hash out this matter of whether or not you needed to be circumcised and do the law. And we'll pick that up again in Acts 15 in verse 22. So after they sort of, lay this whole thing out and everybody weighs in on it, of what they see to be the will of God, in verse 22 it says, "Then pleased it the apostles and elders with the whole church." Everybody's in agreement. All the apostles, all the elders, the whole church that was in that meeting, they all agree, and they to send chosen men of their own company, chosen men, important, special people to them, to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. Because remember, Paul and Barnabas had been traveling together, and they had come to this council to set this matter straight. Namely, Judas, surnamed Barsabbas. Now that's not Barabbas, it's Judas named Barsabbas. And Silas, chief men among the brethren. This is where we first meet Silas. Remember, we started this looking at 1 Thessalonians 1:1, where we saw Paul, Timothy, and Silas were writing unto the church. Here's where Silas first comes on the scene. He's one of two men that were from Jerusalem, who they picked. Verse 23. And it says Silas was chief men, that these two guys were chief men among the brethren. They were really men of reputation, of import. And they wrote letters by them after this manner. This is the letters they wrote. "The apostles and elders and brethren send greetings unto the brethren, which are of the Gentiles, in Antioch and Syria and Cilicia." There's greeting all of these dispersed Judeans. "For as much as we have heard that certain which went out from us have troubled you with words, subverting your souls, saying, Ye must be circumcised and keep the law, to whom we gave no such commandment." So they're sending these letters out to all of these believers out there, all the ones who have been troubled by these Judeans that have come from them and are telling these guys, now if you want to be part of the group, you've got to get circumcised first. To whom we gave no such commandment. We never told them that, okay? We never said that you had to do that. Everybody's been going out saying that they're from us and you've got to be circumcised. We never said so. Verse 25, it seemed good unto us, being assembled with one accord, to send chosen men unto you, with our beloved Barnabas and Paul, men that have hazarded their lives for the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. We have sent therefore Judas and Silas, who shall also tell you the same things by mouth, for it seemed good to the Holy Ghost and to us, it seemed good to God and to us also, to lay upon you no greater burden than these things, that ye abstain from meats offered to idols, and from blood, and from things strangled, and from fornication, from which if ye keep yourselves, ye shall do well. Fare ye well. There's the end of the message. So they give them these letters to take with them. But just in case somebody out there was going to say, well, how do we know that, Peter and James and the guys really wrote this? You could have wrote that and just put their names down on it. How do we really know that's what went on? Well, to prove it, they also sent a couple of witnesses. People that were well known. Judas and Silas. It would be kind of like for us if one day some people from, we'll say, New Jersey came and started, every time we witness to somebody, say, well, those guys, what they say is nice, but, they're not really teaching the right stuff. That's not what we do there. And then we go to New Jersey and we sit down and we have a big meeting and we straighten this whole thing out. But just to make sure that everybody knows that we're all in agreement, not only do we get letters from, we'll say Jerry and Steve, but they send Bob Chatton and, if he's still there, Michael Gilmore. A couple of guys that everybody knows from New Jersey. They know. Everybody knows they're from New Jersey. And everybody knows that these are people in New Jersey who are held in reputation. That's who Silas and Judas were. Where did I leave off? Verse 29. We did that. Verse 30. So when they were dismissed, they came to Antioch. Now they're in Antioch. Antioch is one of the two real important cities outside of Judea. Antioch in Egypt, Alexandria in Egypt, and Antioch in Syria. These were two of the chief cities in the whole Greek Empire that had been and remain to this day important metropolises. And when they were gathered, the multitude together, they delivered the epistle, which when they had read, they rejoiced for the consolation, for the comfort. These guys were like, oh, we don't have to get sacrificed, circumcised? I'm really glad about that. And verse 32, Judas and Silas, being prophets also themselves. These men were men with ministries. They were men with the ministry of a prophet. They exhorted the brethren with many words and confirmed them. And after they had tarried there a space, they let them go in peace from the brethren unto the apostles. Notwithstanding, it pleased Silas to abide there still. So Judas goes back to Jerusalem, and Silas stays there with Paul. And we'll find out more next time about what Paul